We've been talking a lot lately on our show about the opening of U.S.-Cuba ties. On the table, lifting a half-century trade embargo and easing banking and travel restrictions. The negotiations come despite some serious concerns in Congress and in the Cuban-American community.
But U.S. farmers have been generally supportive of the prospect of opening Cuba to greater trade. I talked about the economic potential of the thaw with VOA's Mil Arcega. Check it out.
Welcome to Cuba, where little has changed since 1961 when the U.S. severed diplomatic ties. But that may be changing.
All right, Mil, talking about this opening up of relations between the U.S. and Cuba, who stands to benefit the most?
I think it's a win-win situation for both countries. Now, a lot of people will say, yeah, but Cuba is a very, very small market. It's like number 66 GDP around the world, right? And the U.S. is number 1. So what does the U.S. have to gain? Well, Cuba is very close to the United States, it's a very nearby market, right? And you're talking about a great potential there.
When you talk about the Cuban market, what are going to be the products that the U.S. will want to push out?
Number 1, probably tobacco, for one thing, from Cuba. But I think, see, here's what's interesting. There's a lot in it for the United States because Cuba has a hard time growing enough cattle to eat meat. So they will rely on the United States for a lot of beef imports to this country. They will also need a lot of financial services simply because they're just not geared for it right now. They're not doing a lot of trade around the world, especially not with the biggest economy in the world. So I think what you'll see is a nice give and take. There's a lot of agricultural products in Cuba that we also need to mention, sugar being one of them, sugar and tobacco.
Missouri Senator Claire McCaskill, a Democrat, was with a group of U.S. lawmakers who went to Cuba on a mission to look at trade opportunities for American companies.
And I come from a very big agricultural state. We would love to sell the Cuban people more rice. We would love to sell them more chicken and more beans and more corn. So hopefully this trip will also help my farmers at home.
But any outreach to Cuba faces strong opposition from critics in the Republican-controlled Congress, who say Cuba's smaller economy stands to benefit more. It may be small, but it's a market many American companies want access to.
And you talked about how there already are a lot of food products that Cuba is getting from the U.S.
Right. In fact, 30% of Cuba's food imports already come from the United States. And the only reason that is because in 2000, the embargo on foodstuffs was lifted by the United States. But there were a lot of conditions associated with that, including you need to pay us in cash.
Now, getting back to the cigars, because that's such a popular item when you think about
you think cigars, you think Havana, right?
Exactly.
Industry experts say Cuban cigars could take over as much as a third of the premium cigar market in the U.S. if trade restrictions were lifted. David Savona is executive editor at Cigar Aficionado magazine.
Cuba's the birthplace of cigars. When you think about Cuba, you can't help but think about cigars.
All right, so a big concern for people who aren't so sure about this opening up of relations is that the money that Cuba is going to gain from increased trade is going to go straight into the hands of the Castros. What's been the talk about that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, that argument is made a lot, but if you just think about the remittances that Cubans receive from the United States, you're talking about $2 billion a year. So U.S. money is already entering the country. There's no question about that. There's the other argument that I'm hearing from some economists from the IMF that suggests that, look, it may be a small market, but if you open this up, you may actually be in for some political change as well, because there is an appetite for reform. The vast majority of Americans support lifting the trade embargo, some 68%. And even if you look at the Cubans who have been hurt a lot by U.S. economic policies, they have very positive attitudes about the United States. The only holdouts would be a few members in Congress who support older generation Cuban Americans, primarily in Florida, who still have a lot of ill feelings towards the Castro regime. And that's really the biggest holdup there. Otherwise, from an economic standpoint, from an emotional standpoint, from a nationalistic standpoint, it all makes sense, I think, for both sides.